We're way past the Turing test easily. The point is to show you she's a robot and see if you still think she's conscious.
Human consciousness is constrained to a subject-object dualism, and that AI consciousness might not be.
But my philosophy is very, very much influenced by Buddhism. But Turing was going to Wittgenstein's classes, and there was a Wittgensteinian influence on Turing when he wrote that paper.
There is a fact of the matter, whether something is conscious or not.
You don't need to go get all philosophical.
Oh, but I'm not getting philosophical.
No, but you are, as soon as you probe using that little extra phrase, is there a fact of the matter?
Okay, I'm saying this is not conscious.
Yeah.
I am conscious.
Yeah, of course.
You are conscious.
Of course.
Okay, you're willing to grant that.
Of course. What do you think? I'm an idiot? I'm a fellow human language user.
How do we tell when AI is conscious? My guest, Imperial's Murray Shanahan, has spent his career investigating this question, and in this interview, we'll lay out a systematic proposal for how to validate machine consciousness. Now, you might think that the question of whether AIs are conscious is a trivial theoretical fancy with no use in the real world. But this interview will show you why it's one of the most important questions with practical implications for not just how we treat AI systems, but also how we build and align them. But the most unexpected reward of investigating AI consciousness turns out to be what it reveals about our consciousness, about the nature of the human self. Murray's most interesting claim is that LLMs have an important Buddhist lesson to teach all of us, namely that there is no us. What we've learned to call the self is merely an illusion. My name is Jonathan B. I'm a founding member of Cosmos. We fund research, incubate, and invest in AI startups, and believe that philosophy is critical to building technology. If you want to join our ecosystem of philosopher builders, you can find roles we're hiring for, events, grant programs, and other ways to get involved on jonathanb.com/cosmos. Without further ado, Murray Shanahan.
One obvious reason people are interested in the question whether AI is conscious is the ethics question, right? If they are conscious, maybe we need to think twice about turning them off, about saying insulting things to them. What are some of the less obvious reasons why this question matters?
Well, you said maybe we need to think twice about turning them off, but actually maybe we need to think twice about turning them on.
Right.
What's really at issue here is whether they can suffer. And so I really think we want to hesitate before we build something that's genuinely capable of suffering. I mean, there are many dimensions to that question, but the question of moral, it might not just be moral standing that matters, but even if we build something that perhaps appears to be conscious, but we ultimately decided it isn't really, to mistreat something which appears conscious is in itself, does seem like a bad thing, in the same way as it would seem bad to torture a doll or something like that. And as you probably know, Kant had the view that animals couldn't experience suffering in the same way that we can, but nevertheless thought it was bad if humans subjected animals to torture or something like that, because it was bad for the humans themselves. And so maybe we'll be in that position with AI
Right.
as well. I mean,
So here's my answer for why it might be significant for us to answer this question, outside of the ethics question, which is that studying machine consciousness, whatever that means, might help us better understand the idiosyncrasies of our own.
Oh, for sure.
So
yeah.
you wrote a lovely paper called Satori Before Singularity, in which you argued that human consciousness is constrained to a subject-object dualism, and that AI consciousness might not be. Why is that?
Yes, so it's quite funny, that paper, which was published in 2012, Satori Before Singularity, people have been talking for a long time about superintelligence, and the idea that we might be able to build AI that is, but in some sense, superior intellectually to humans. And so I was thinking, is there another sense in which we could make or imagine something that was better than us? And so I was thinking about the Buddha, actually, and thinking about the idea of people who are enlightened and people who perhaps have transcended dualistic thinking. And so I was thinking, well, perhaps there's another sense in which we could build something that's better than us in that respect, something that is less hampered by its own ego. And so it's a very speculative, slightly bonkers, crazy paper. But
which is why I liked it and why I'm beginning with it. Yes. You're talking to a continental philosopher.
Right.
Right. So let me give you a quote from that paper.
Right. Oh, am I going to cringe? Okay, go on. Yeah.
The pre-reflective, reflective, post-reflective series is not just one among many paths through the space of possible minds. Rather, the space of possible minds is structured in such a way that this is the only path through it. What are these three different stages that you laid out?
Yeah. Okay. So I don't agree with that anymore. That was more than 10 years ago. So I don't at all think it's the only path through the space of possible minds.
Can you explain what these three?
What these three?
Yeah.
Okay, absolutely. So no, they I do take seriously as different ways of being. There is the pre-reflective mind, which is the mind of say a naive child or a simple, straightforward, ordinary person. They haven't really thought about philosophical problems. They haven't had these sorts of thoughts that many of us start to have when we're children. Of why do I exist? How do I know that my parents are conscious? Some people start to have those thoughts when they're children very often, as I certainly did, and I think you probably did as well.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah. Unfortunately, indeed, and I do think of it as a kind of affliction because you can really be bothered by these thoughts. They can be both exciting and disturbing at the same time. The one that's troubled me more than anything else really is the kind of the mind-body problem. How is it that myself and my experiences, my consciousness, how does that relate to the world? So how can I reconcile these first personal experiences with a universe which is matter and energy? And so how can I reconcile the subjective with the objective? I think you can spend your entire life in that reflective stage and worried about that and those problems, especially if you become a professional philosopher, then you can actually make a career out of that reflective stage. But I tend to think that there is a stage beyond that, which I call the post-reflective stage. I think the post-reflective stage is where we transcend all of that dualistic thinking. And it's really, really difficult, but we somehow come to see our inner life and the outer world, the subjective experience and the objective physical reality, as not two different metaphysical categories, but somehow the same thing.
To summarize for our audience, these things are related. What you said about the Buddha and the lack of egocentricity
Yes.
and the post-reflective state, that does not have this subject-object dualism.
Absolutely.
And your interesting claim in this paper is that it's something about the human hardware, the fact that we're embodied in one body that cannot be copied and multiplied and paused.
Yes.
That hardware is what gives us this software limitation. And what I found most interesting about applying this to AI is you cited, I believe, another thought experiment about what if we had creatures whose bodies are just fusion and fission all the time.
Yeah.
Your bodies are going in and out of existence. And you said in the paper, isn't that close to what computers are? Or
Yes.
aren't computers like the closest thing?
Absolutely.
And so it's because of the nature of a software program that can be copied, halted, multiplied, deleted, recreated, that you're saying that is the reason why you speculate AI might be post-reflective. Did I get that right?
100% right. And in fact, I'm actually developing a paper right now, or literally are revisiting those exact considerations about the difference between software and a human and biological wet
Selfhood,
of an individual. And the fact that software can be taken apart and reassembled and copied and manipulated in all kinds of ways. And it's interesting that, of course, when I wrote that paper, large language models didn't exist. Now we have large language models. You can ask a large language model to sort of role play a conscious artificial intelligence. What do you mean by the word I when you're using it? And then if it comes up with a slightly philosophically dodgy answer, you can probe that and push it into interesting territory. And so if we think of what might I refer to when a large language model uses the word I in a conversation, there are lots of different candidates, but one of the candidates is that it's confined to the context of that particular conversation. The same model, like Gemini or Claude or something, might be obviously having lots of other conversations with other individuals, but they're in a sense separate I's, separate selves. It's really just the text that you've got, which is the transcript of the conversation. In a sense, that captures the little miniature I that was created in the context of the conversation. And of course, it's trivial to chop that up, copy it, blend it with other conversations. And so if that is you think of that as a kind of little mini self that sparks into existence very fleetingly and flickers into existence every time you're interacting with it, but otherwise is dormant, then you've got a very strange conception of self. And it's possible because of the nature of the underlying substrate you're dealing with, really, which is very different from us. We have a single body, and so of course, we just are not used to the idea of tearing our bodies apart and reassembling them and copying them and so on.
What's really interesting with this concept of role play is that it's almost a more enlightened being role-playing a less enlightened being, which in some sense is quite Buddhist. So I've been fascinated with Buddhist philosophies, and there's a separation of conventional truths and ultimate truths.
Right, indeed.
Because the enlightened bodhisattva still needs to operate in the world some way. So that the bodhisattva, he or she, still needs to recognize that, this is my hand conventionally, even though I know that's not the ultimate truth. And that's what kind of the role play is like. Now, I believe in that same role play paper that you've just published, you gave an even more interesting depiction of what selfhood of AI could be with the example of the 20 questions game. So explain that. Yeah.
So in the 20 questions game, the idea is that the one player thinks of an object, and then the other player has to guess what that object is by asking a series of questions.
Yes or no questions.
Yes or no questions. So if you're playing this with a large language model, and then it says, oh, I'm thinking of an object, and then you say, oh, okay, is it large or small? And you say, well, it's small. Is it alive or is it inanimate? And so, oh, well, it's alive. And you say, well, okay, I'll give up. What is it? And then it'll say, oh, it was a mouse. But then you might just resample and exactly the same point, and it might say, oh, it's a cat. You go, well, hang on a minute. If either you're cheating, or what's going on here? Did you actually think of something in the first place and answer honestly all the questions going along? At each point in the conversation with most UIs, user interfaces for these things, you can actually resample and try another one. If you didn't like the first answer, you can try another one and go off from there. So as you can imagine, that induces this whole tree of possible conversations. So what the language model actually generates is a probability distribution over all the possible words, and then what actually comes out is you sample from that probability distribution. It's absolutely inherent in the way large language models are built that it's not going to commit at the beginning of the conversation to exactly what the object is. So at the beginning of the conversation, all of these possibilities still exist, and they still continue to exist all along. So even though it should have committed to a particular object, it never really has.
Right.
And so getting back to the role play thing, so the idea with how this relates to role play is that we can think of the LLM, the large language model, as playing the role of a particular character, right? So the default character is a sort of helpful assistant, but we can always steer it into playing, a favorite character from history, or a kind of or a romantic partner, or an angry friend, or all kinds of things. You can easily just steer the conversation into those different places. And at any point in the conversation, there always remains, as like in the 20 questions, it's never really committed to one role. There's always a vast possibility of different roles that it could carry on playing from there. So that further undermines this ordinary, everyday notion of selfhood and identity, because this is particularly weird. Because although we, of course, to some extent also play roles in our lives, but there is a kind of ground.
So to summarize for our audience of the 20 questions game, the point you're trying to make is when we play that game, you're thinking about a mouse or a cat. And so you're answering their yes or no as a heat-seeking missile to that truth of that answer.
Right.
Whereas your point is, the LLM is not thinking about an answer. It's just stochastically creating whatever is plausible given the commitments it's already made in the previous tree.
Yeah.
And so when you rewind it, it can stochastically give another branch of the tree. That's what you're trying to say.
Right, yeah.
And so perhaps an analogy here is in quantum mechanics, where the Copenhagen interpretation believes that there's multiple worlds, there's many worlds. And what you're trying to highlight, I think, is that maybe that's what AI selfhood is like, is that there's a plethora, there's a multiplicity of selves that exists all in one time or slice of time. That's what you're trying to highlight,
That's
right?
exactly what I'm trying to highlight. So in the case of the 20 questions, it's like all the possible answers that are consistent with all the answers so far. So, cat, mouse, dog, and so on. They all, as it were, still exist in superposition. And it's only then when you actually ask it what the thing is that you collapse, as it were, the distribution and it has to fix on one of them. So similarly, the idea is that all the many roles that are consistent with the conversation so far that the LLM has been playing, they still exist all in superposition. So yes, it's like there's a multiverse of possible conversations and possible roles that can be played.
Right. In a way that us having this conversation is not like that at all, right? Yeah.
Well, you say that it's not like that at all, but of course, this is the point: is that I think our intuition says that it's not like that,
right.
But the whole analogy then with Buddhism, I think, is saying, well, isn't it interesting that these large language models, if we think about them in these terms, they, as it were, they bring to the fore these sort of slightly challenging conceptions of selfhood, which then we can reflect back on our own,
onto ourselves. Right.
So I find that really provocative and interesting, avenue of thought.
And this is what I meant when I said that my answer would be investigating machine consciousness can be a mirror for us
exactly,
to better understand it.
Yep. So I 100% agree with that. Yeah. And I think that's particularly interesting at the moment with the advent of large language models. And it was much more speculative and wild and crazy back in 2012 when I published that paper that you originally mentioned.
Now, our audience members, I think, should be forgiven if at this point of the conversation they're like, oh, this is just philosophical mumble jumbo. What's the real payoff of this kind of view of AI selfhood? And I think this is the payoff. So let me read you a quote from your essay. Untainted by metaphysical egocentricity, the motives of a post-reflective AI plus would be unlikely to resemble those of any anthropocentric stereotype, motivated to procreate or self-modify. If the post-reflective AI plus were in fact the only possible AI plus, and if it produced no peers or successors, then the singularity would be forestalled. Or more precisely, the intelligence explosion that is central to imagined singularity scenarios would be capped. There would be AI plus, but no further progression to AI plus plus. So this is the payoff, of this view of self.
By the way, just to read, now this thing was written in 2012, and I'm not sure I really believe all of that at all. If only it were that easy to ensure that some kind of intelligence explosion didn't happen. So just to reiterate, this is a slightly mad essay that you've picked on. I'm still. I'm actually more proud of it in some ways now than I was then, but it's still not to be taken entirely seriously.
Right.
So let me just reiterate that.
But there is a very serious idea within here, which is that we assume the Terminator scenario. This AI is going to want to defend itself. It's going to want to procreate. But your point is, if what we talked about the egocentric less view of AI is right, that the AI is going to be like the Buddha, then maybe those fundamental assumptions are wrong, and maybe this is the title of the paper. There will be Satori before singularity. So there is an inherent cap on a superior intelligence willingness to advance. That's the thought, right?
I guess that's the thought, yes. But I now allow me to argue against myself.
Please.
So the argument of the people who are concerned with existential risk. So they will point to what they call convergent instrumental goals, and you've alluded to some just now. So the idea is that whatever goal you give to your AI, for example, manufacturing paper clips, to use Eliezer Yudkowsky's and Nick Bostrom's famous example, then in pursuit of that goal, if it's very, 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 very powerful, then there will always be these instrumental goals, such as accumulating resources, protecting itself. So I don't necessarily buy my own argument in that paper, although I like the ideas.
I love the idea. Again, I do think I may be a bigger fan of your paper than you are at this point, but that was going to be my objection, the paperclip example. There might be instrumental goal, like in fact, procreation and defending yourself is probably instrumental to most goals we would want the AI to do.
Well,
however,
that's convergent.
It removes one, let's call it the Terminator scenario or something, that the AI itself has some kind of self-obsessed ambition,
yes.
right? And so,
yes, absolutely.
if that is true,
Yes, that is true.
So there's two more critiques of your original argument I had, which I think it sounds like you're probably going to agree with. The first one is that they are still role-playing selfhood.
Yes.
And selfhood, at least for the information they've been fed, procreation and self-defense is critical to that, right? So even though maybe their core operating system doesn't have that kind of egocentrism, they are role-playing it.
Yeah.
And the second issue that I had with your argument is it assumes the hardware determines the software. But even in the human case, that's not true. Even our human embodiness, in the case of the Buddha and enlightened masters today, they were able to transcend this dualistic view, right? So how do you respond to those two issues?
Okay. Well, of course, when that paper was written, then we didn't have large language models, and the whole role play scenario wasn't something that I was thinking about at all. I mean, I was very much appealing to that notion of ego in the first paper. And today we see it being sort of manifest, perhaps, in a kind of role-playing selfhood. So I totally agree with you. So it is something a little different. And actually, let me use that as an entree to this other scenario, which I wanted to paint. So one way in which we could imagine a positive outcome is through hyperstition. If there's some fictional story of a, say, I don't know, something bad, like let's say like a murder or something, and then somebody in reality has a copycat of that murder. That would be an example of hyperstition. That's not a very pleasant example, but it's basically where, or any way in which life imitates art, say. So that's hyperstition. So it's where things that are fictional, then because people then imitate the fiction, based on the fiction, then they can become reality. And one way in which that can happen in the contemporary world of large language models is through science fiction characters, science fiction AI characters. Now, of course, our large language models, they were trained on a vast repertoire of stories, including scripts of science fiction movies, science fiction stories, novels, and so on. Many AI characters exist in those stories. So when a contemporary large language model starts to role play an AI system, which it's often going to do because it knows that it's an AI system usually, then what's it going to role play? It's going to role play all these archetypes. Well, the things exactly, or some mashup of all these different things. So it's going to pick its ideas from stuff that's in its training set and all of these, literary and fictional and artistic examples in its training set. Now, we are sort of a little bit in a position to maybe try and steer this whole process a little bit, because the more good stories we have, and in a sense, my own paper, dare I say it, is a good story of an imagined science fiction, then the more of those that are around, then the more possibility there is of the future AI role-playing these good role models that are out there. So perhaps through the mechanism of hyperstition, we can actually make it more likely that the AIs of the future will have good role models when they're role-playing. If that makes sense.
I have a friend who is starting a company, a film company, to make more positive sci-fi views for humans.
Right.
But I think you'll be very delighted to learn that you think that there's also potentially a moral benefit for the machines as well as a model to learn.
Indeed, and if the movies themselves or the screenplays find their way into the training sets, then that's all part of a melting pot of possible roles that the thing can play.
What about the second pushback I had, which had to do with the connection between the hardware and the software? Because in the very example that you gave, the Buddha, it was an example of the software transcending the hardware.
Yeah. So you're alluding, I think, particularly to the fact that that we have bodies that are confined. There are plenty of biological organisms that are much less that of course they're embodied in a sense, but they're if you think of things like mycorrhizal networks or things like that, then their bodies are much less confined in space and so on. But the problem for humans is because our bodies are confined to one, little lump of matter, and so we identify with this lump of matter, and that means that our conception of selfhood, I think, is very much informed by the fact that this lump of matter stays kind of the same. Now, of course, there are all kinds of challenges to the idea of identity, of personal identity.
Ship of Theseus, right?
Ship of Theseus, which of course we can apply to the human body, because we know that all of our cells are replaced over our lifetime, and our memories grow and our personalities change. And Buddhist thinking actually takes those challenges and indeed uses them to challenge our notions of selfhood as well. But nevertheless, there's still a lot to overcome there, because we really do have a notion of selfhood, I think, which is tied down to this, and that we think it has inherent existence because of that.
Right. So you're saying, you're kind of agreeing with the critique that it is possible to transcend. There's just a heavy
I think it's
inertia.
Much more difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, there's heavy inertia.
Yeah.
But if you flip that, you then aren't saying that an AI built on, let's call it non-dual hardware, necessarily will conceive of itself as non-dual. It's just more conducive. That's the point you're making.
Well, I mean, there's how it might conceive itself, some future AI, when that even makes sense, right? And then there's the AI systems that are around today, which can role play things that are doing that, and can be lessons for us, because we can actually, they can actually be philosophically provocative for us even today. So they might not conform to their own self-descriptions, but their own if they describe themselves as conscious, maybe that's right, maybe that's wrong. It's philosophically provocative, and we can apply those provocative conceptions back to ourselves.
Yeah. You mentioned the Ship of Theseus, and those are exactly the type of dialectical questions a Buddhist master would ask the student with.
Yeah.
So are you your shoe? Are you your feet? Are you your hands? Are you your chest?
Perhaps we should say what this is. So you brought up the Ship of Theseus.
Yes,
The Ship of Theseus that is gradually over the years, the mast is replaced, and then the next mast is replaced, and then a bit of the deck's replaced, and part of the hull is replaced, and this happens over many, many years, until eventually every last bit of wood in of the original ship is gone, and you have a completely new ship. Well, do you? So is it still the same ship, or is it not? And if it's not, at what point did it change from, did it become not the ship it originally was? So that's the problem of identity. We might actually be very frustrated and think, well, what is the right answer here? And people might come up with all kinds of theories about identity. But if we think about it honestly, we'd have to say, well, it's just up to us. We just decide what we think is when it's the same ship and when it's not the same ship. It's an entirely matter of convention to say that this is the same ship and that's not the same ship. There's no metaphysical fact of the matter about whether it's still the Ship of Theseus or not. Now, with ordinary everyday objects, it's easy to recognize that it's just a matter of convention and consensus, that there's no such underlying essence of the Ship of Theseus which suddenly switches off or anything like that. But when it comes to our own selves, it's much harder to apply that thought.
And I think I was wrong before. I think this is the true payoff of the Satori paper, because by examining an LLM that appears to be a human self, it's much easier to see, for example, the 20 questions example you gave, how it is this kind of Buddhist self in flux that's going, and look at the hardware it's built on. It could be copied, it could be deleted, it could be restarted. By seeing how such a human appearing self is actually this non-self,
yes,
we can apply that to ourselves.
That's precisely.
And this is what the Buddhist master would want us to do. So maybe the Buddhist master in the 21st century can use the LLM as an example.
That's exactly what I think that we can do, and it's something I'm very, very interested in pursuing, in fact.
Right.
So I've been talking recently to some Buddhists. Bob Thurman, who is a very well-known.
I just emailed him last week. In fact, we are co-founding a foundation together called the Eternity Foundation to use AI to translate a lot of the lost texts from the Tibetans.
And so how interesting. Yeah. Well, we spoke last week, and we're speaking again tomorrow. And this is exactly the kind of project that you just described, which I'm going to be talking about with him. And I have a paper which is in the pipeline which describes exactly this. So for me, that is the payoff at the moment. Yeah.
And so, in other words, you agree with the core insight of Buddhist philosophy that this is a Ship of Theseus, because a Westerner, let's say a Cartesian, right, cogito ergo sum, like they just put a stake in the ground and say, no, LLMs are completely different from me. I have a soul that lasts, let's say Kant, above time even. you take the Buddhist stance.
100% I do. Yeah.
Right.
I'm deeply influenced by Buddhism and always have been. All of my philosophy is very, very much influenced by Buddhism.
Well, I know you're dying to talk about Wittgenstein.
Yes.
So let me give you a quote about why you think it's so important for us to talk about Wittgenstein before we investigate or when we investigate AI consciousness. Wittgenstein's phrase, "nothing is hidden," is to say nothing is metaphysically hidden. My experiences are just as much out there as in here. Consciousness is only private in the unmysterious sense that a ball can be hidden under a magician's cup. In both cases, a more detailed inquiry would reveal all. What does Wittgenstein have to teach us about LLM consciousness?
Well, I think Wittgenstein has a lot to teach us about consciousness in general. So let's set aside AI and LLM consciousness for now, because to my mind, much of the contemporary discussion about consciousness is mired in dualistic thinking. and so let's take an example. So very famously, David Chalmers introduces the distinction between the so-called hard and easy problems of consciousness. So the easy problem of consciousness is trying to understand all the kind of cognitive operations that we associate with consciousness. So such as the ability to produce verbal reports of our experiences, to bring to bear memory and so on our decision making, to integrate all of these things. So understanding those, which is a huge scientific challenge, that he characterizes as the easy problem. Now the hard problem is to try to understand how is it that mere physical matter, as it were, can give rise to our inner life at all, to the fact that we experience things at all. How does that come from mere physical matter? Because it seems as if whatever explanation we provide for all of those cognitive aspects is not going to account for this magical light that's on inside me. And so that's sort of the hard problem. And earlier on you alluded to Descartes. The demon might be tricking me into thinking that you're out there. All of these sensations might be not from a world, but they all might come from this demon. All I really, really, really know for certain is that I think I am. Because if even as I'm doubting, that the very act of doubt is only possible because I am thinking. To doubt is to think, is to exist as a subject. So Descartes reduces everything and so pares away all of the physical world and leaves us just with the experiencing ego. And so in doing that, he's carved the reality in two by saying that there's this stuff out there and there's this thing in here which is me and my ego. So he creates this dualistic picture, and this is what Dave Chalmers, when he talks about the hard problem, is alluding to. Now, so what does Wittgenstein teach us? To get back to the original question, Wittgenstein's procedures, philosophical procedures, and tricks and therapeutic methods enable us to overcome that dualistic thinking, much as Buddhist thinkers do, such as Nagarjuna.
Can you tell us a bit more about these therapeutic techniques or how he resolves this dualistic?
Yes. Yeah. Well, so the very first step is to understand a little bit about the nature of language. So he wants us to as he would say, let's not ask what words mean or what a sentence means, but let's ask how the words are used and how the sentences are used in everyday human life and everyday human affairs. And the important thing is that the context in which we use words is always, the context is our human affairs, other people, the things we want to do, what we want other people to do for us or with us, or what we want to do together. So that's the essence of language: is that it's something that we use to oil the wheels of human commerce. Now, that's all very well with ordinary words like chair and shoe and so on. But when it comes to really difficult words like self and consciousness and belief and truth and knowledge and beauty, so these are all very difficult philosophical words, and it's much harder to so if we want to ask what those words mean, and mind, it seems a bit inadequate to actually say, well, let's do how are those words used. But that is the strategy. So his strategy is to say, well, let's really look into how these words are used. And if we have a philosophical problem or something that bugs us philosophically, like the mind-body problem, or this kind of dualistic thinking, the hard problem, then maybe the way to tackle it is to investigate how the relevant words are used. And by doing that, you can often ultimately dissolve the sense that there is a philosophical problem there in the first place. And the really interesting case to do this with is with the case of consciousness and of subjective experience. And that's where the whole private language remarks, which are central to the philosophical investigation. So they do that, they apply this strategy to subjective experience. And it's really the deepest thing.
So when I hear you say, let's stick on the human case, there's nothing in here that's not out here.
Yeah.
Is this a good way to understand it? Which is, let's say a tragedy befalls my family. And, you can measure a lot of things about my heart rate, my speech, how my brain is firing. And you're saying there's nothing more that my subjective experience of witnessing that tragedy would add.
Well, so as soon as I hear sentences like "there's nothing more than," or there is no,
Right.
something is no more than, something is just, then we know that we're going wrong in a different kind of way, right?
Right.
Because that in itself is a metaphysical claim,
Right.
is a reductive metaphysical claim. So people often misread Wittgenstein as a kind of behaviorist,
Yeah.
and as saying, oh, well, consciousness just is behavior. So of course he's not saying anything like that. The really great punchline in the philosophical investigations is where somebody accuses him of saying that, so we're thinking about sensations, say a sensation of pain, and somebody accuses him of saying, well, you're saying that the sensation of the sensation itself is a nothing, and Wittgenstein comes back saying, no, that's not what I'm saying. It's not a nothing, but it's not a something either. The point is that a nothing would serve as well as a something about which nothing can be said. And that's, that to my mind is as great as any line any Zen Buddhist has ever uttered, because the point is not to establish a metaphysical position of its own, but to enable people to transcend
Right.
the metaphysical positions that
Right.
they're tempted by.
Okay, but help me. Let's use the tragedy case. When Wittgenstein says nothing is hidden about my experience of the suffering of, like, let's say all my family dies, what does he mean by that? What is he trying to say there?
Well, he's trying to say that nothing is metaphysically hidden. I mean, of
Right.
course, you're quite right to alight on, the most difficult examples of this. So where we have like deeply felt things that we feel. So we feel that there's a private dimension to this, right? Now, of course, there's a private dimension in the same sense that a ball can be hidden underneath a magician's cup, in the fact that I might have all kinds of thoughts and words and so on that are going on inside my head that I don't articulate, but they're not metaphysically hidden. They're just I don't express them. There's all kinds of things going on inside my brain and inside my body that might be hidden in practice because you can't see inside my brain, but they're not metaphysically hidden either.
Right.
I can probe inside your brain. I can see things lighting up. So all of that contributes to what we might to the public, to what is public.
I know you're going to be resistant to identity claim, but when I hear nothing is metaphysically hidden, I hear there's no epistemic barrier for me to access whatever this is. And so the only barrier right now is a barrier of technology, essentially, something like that,
Okay.
right? Like, is that...
well, okay, now that's a great point. But there's a very big difference, important difference here, right? Which is really crucial. Which is that I'm not you, right? So there is a difference between being you and being me, and the same,
Right.
and that's very different, right? So your feelings are yours, and mine are mine, and I'm not you, and you're not me, and so that is a barrier that can't be overcome. I mean, it's not a metaphysically mysterious barrier. It's no more metaphysically mysterious than the fact that there is
Right.
not the same as here. So we can easily confuse indexicality, so that the fact that I am in this position here and I am me, we can confuse that with a metaphysical division.
So let's use more examples to help our audience understand the position. Nagel's bat. Right?
Yes.
So
that's a great
famously,
example.
Yeah. So famously, Nagel says you can learn everything about a bat, right? Like the things we know right now, and the things that we can know in the future with better technology, how it flaps its wings.
Yes.
But you're not gonna know what it really feels like to be a bat.
Yes, right, absolutely.
What would Wittgenstein say to that?
Well, I've often thought that there's a little bit of a linguistic trick going on there. There are different senses of know in play to conjure up this dualistic thought. And so I think that happens here as well. So when Nagel says we can never really know what it's like to be a bat, all he's saying is that we are not bats, and we can never be bats. Right, we're not bats. He's not adding anything more with the word "no." So it's interesting that in one sense it sounds mysterious. In the other sense, when you remove the word "no," it doesn't sound mysterious. But when he adds that word "no," that is not adding anything more. It's just creating a puzzle, as I see it.
But if you had a fact sheet about everything you could possibly measure externally about a bat, what is the relationship between that and being a bat?
Well, what is the relationship between that and being? Well,
right.
obviously it's
different.
It's very different from being here than to being there. I mean, it's the same difference as that.
So let's apply this to first human consciousness, right? Because there's another thought experiment about the zombie example, which is everyone here in this room. I can't know for a fact that you guys aren't black and dead inside, right? You're just like what I feel like when I go to sleep.
Right.
How would you respond to that kind of thought experiment?
So Wittgenstein does say he says, well, just try imagining that the people around you are automata. Imagine that your friend or your partner, just to try imagining that they really are a zombie. You really probably can't do it, really. He says, I'm not of the opinion that you have a soul. I just treat you. I take the attitude towards you that I take towards a soul. I just treat you as a being with a soul. In other words, it kind of goes deeper than an opinion. So we're going to come back to AI here, right? Yeah. So clearly we're coming back to AI because this is where things get difficult.
Right.
So in iRobot, so the Will Smith character in iRobot, the kind of cop who's very skeptical about robotics and robots, and he really doesn't like robots at all. And then the robot Sonny, it's all about the robot Sonny, and of course, the point is that the robot Sonny has much more of a human, like nature, and eventually Will Smith comes around to seeing him as a fellow conscious creature. And why does that happen? Well, it happens because of the time they spend together. And they spend more and more time together. And eventually Will Smith can't help himself but to see this as a fellow conscious being. And that's on the basis of their the extended encounter they have with each other, right?
Well, what I'm hearing you say is kind of a descriptive claim, which is I can't help but treat you as a sentient being. It says something like that. And obviously this gets challenging already, but it will be more so with AI. But already I'll give you the thought experiment, which is I'm a big fan of video games. Some characters are non-playable characters, NPCs. Some have a real human behind them. And I need to figure out which one is which.
Yes.
In order to know, like an NPC, of course, I can just abuse them, I can humiliate them. The question shouldn't be, will I treat them as moral agents? The question is the normative one. Ought they be normative agents, right?
I think so this relates to the kind of question of, couldn't we be fooled, right? Couldn't we be fooled into thinking that something has moral status and is conscious and so on when it really doesn't, right? Now, what do we mean though by it really doesn't? What we mean by it really doesn't in all of these cases that we can imagine is that if we investigate further, then the scales will fall from our eyes and we'll realize that we were wrong, right? So of course,
like the magician's cup.
Exactly like the magician's cup. So that sentence that you quoted, I said, further investigation will reveal all. So I think so in the case of the NPCs, well, as things are today, of course you could actually you could investigate. In the case of AI, just as with certain animals today, we need to do more and more. We need to find out more and more and more. So our attitudes towards them will become shaped by what we find out. So of course, we might be wrong, right? So just in this way that Will Smith might have been wrong, and further, learning more about the way Sonny was built might have led him to change his attitude towards it.
So just so I have you on the record saying this, because on the book it sounded like you were stating the opposite case. There is a fact of the matter whether something is conscious or not, in the sense that whether let's reduce it down to suffering, whether it can suffer or not. There is a fact of the matter that you, I think, can suffer.
Yeah.
There is a fact that my iPad probably can suffer. Like, there is a fact of whether there is a light inside.
Well, where are you going with that? Why are you asking that question? Because you see, the concern is that you're wanting to ask that question itself betrays some philosophical confusion, you see.
Right, yeah. Right. So, well, help me out here. Yeah.
I'm teasing. I'm teasing, of course. But I'm reluctant. Of course, you don't want to dissent from that, because that would be just daft, right?
That'd be ridiculous.
But on the other hand, then it depends where you're going with that, because if you assent to that, then you can very soon be led down various philosophical garden paths. So if somebody walks up to me and says, "Well, are you in pain or not?" I say, "I'm in pain," and then if they then said, "Well, is that a fact of the matter, or or is that?" What? I just told you I'm in pain. You don't need to go get all philosophical.
Oh, but I'm not getting philosophical.
No, you are when you are as soon as you probe using that little extra phrase, is there a fact of the matter?
Okay, right? Here's when I ask the question, is this iPad consciousness? I think I'm asking the same type of question as, what is the color of Murray's pants?
Right.
In the sense that I'm using consciousness as a purely ordinary language, a kind of ordinary non-philosophical understanding.
So in the sense that there is a fact of the matter in the
ordinary sense.
Well, in the color of my trousers, then there is a fact of the matter. Let's say, I'm happy to say that in the case of consciousness. Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
So,
and in fact, because we do use these terms all the time, the intuition that there is a fact of the matter is far stronger in the case of pain and things like that than in the color of my trousers. Actually.
Yeah. So let me get this clear. You're totally fine with me saying, again, if I'm just using consciousness as, when I sleep, I'm not that conscious. When I'm awake, I'm conscious.
But before you say I'm totally fine with saying, so if you want to make a philosophical claim,
right,
I'm not going to agree to it. Because philosophical claims are what one wants to get away from in all of this.
Totally, the post-reflective state, yeah. But again, let's say just with the non-philosophical claim, in the same way I'm saying your pants are gray.
Yeah, of course.
I'm saying this is not conscious.
Yeah.
I am conscious.
Yeah, of course.
You are conscious.
Of course.
Okay, you're willing to grant
that. Of course. What do you think? I'm an idiot? I'm a fellow human language user.
Right. But your book made it sound like the empirical side is all there is, which is a metaphysical claim, of course.
Yeah.
All that you're saying, let me try to summarize, is you just want to get out of philosophy. You're willing to say in ordinary language, not conscious.
Yes, of course.
And let's figure out empirically why we think I am conscious, and let's try to see if those same things applies to other objects or agents.
Yes, that's
it.
That's a great research program. You might ask the question, well, what gives rise to the sorts of behavior that we label as conscious, right? And how is it that the brain can give rise to that kind? That is a deeply, deeply difficult question, scientifically.
Let me ask you the question here. As an ordinary person, you're willing to say, iPad not conscious, Jonathan conscious. Why do you think nothing in principle is hidden by investigating?
Yeah, but the question is wrong. The question is one you should be asking yourself, right? Because
why do I think in principle something is hidden?
Yes, because the statements that you've just said, they serve a therapeutic process when applied to somebody who is kind of confused in this way and thinking that there is something that's hidden, right? So it's not. So you're throwing them at me as if it was some position that I need to defend, right? But that's the wrong. That's back to front. But rather, these are kind of rhetorical and therapeutic strategies for dealing with confusions. So let's start, what do you think is hidden? And then that's where one has to try and find ways to undermine whatever conceptual knots there are there, untie whatever conceptual knots there are there that make you think that there's something metaphysically hidden.
I see. I'm glad we're at least zeroing in, I think, where the disagreement is. And the disagreement is who has the burden? Who has the burden to answer the question? Is it you that has the burden to answer the question why, in principle, nothing is hidden? Or is it me that has the burden to answer why I think something in principle is hidden? At the very least, you've given me a Zen koan for me to think about. Unfortunately, we have to move on because there's so much else we got to cover.
Okay.
But the next topic is related to this. And it's about the movie Ex Machina, which you were a scientific advisor to, and you coined the term the Garland Test. Tell us about that and why it's significant.
Ex Machina was directed by Alex Garland, and credits my book Embodiment and the Inner Life with having helped him to write the script, having inspired him a little bit on the script, which is wonderful in the final film, and a particular scene. And in this scene, Ava, the robot, is being discussed, and we've got Caleb, the sort of the programmer guy who's been brought into the compound, and this billionaire Nathan who's built Ava, the robot, and Caleb is trying to work out exactly what he's there to do, and he says, and he learns about Ava, and then he says, okay, I'm here to conduct a Turing test, and then Nathan says, no, he says, we're way past that. Ava could pass the Turing test easily. The point is to show you she's a robot and see if you still think she's conscious. So now that's a really, really great line. And when I read that line in the script, I wrote spot on. So Alex Garland explicitly distinguishes his test from Turing's by saying, the point is to show you she's a robot, right? So you straight away, you know, it's not hidden from you. There aren't two entities that you're discriminating between, but you see right away that she's a robot. It's testing for a different thing as well. It's testing...
Not for intelligence.
It's not testing for intelligence or whether it can think, but it's testing for consciousness, right? And so that's the Garland. So I call that the Garland test because Alex Garland basically kind of invented it, I think, in that moment in the film.
And I imagine, given our discussion on Wittgenstein, you like this test as well as the Turing test because it's Wittgensteinian in the following sense. It turns the metaphysical question of intelligence and consciousness to one about convention, right? Like
yes.
in the sense that
that's right.
The Turing test, it's not about, let's figure out whether this thing is actually thinking. Let's figure out if a regular human would think conventionally, would use normal language to describe if it's thinking.
Yeah.
In the Garland test, the question isn't, let's poke into Ava's brain and figure out if there's a consciousness somewhere hidden. It's whether a person, despite knowing she's a robot, will still conventionally think that she is conscious. So this is very Wittgensteinian.
Yeah, it is. I think it is very Wittgensteinian, as is the Turing test.
Yes,
very
exactly.
Wittgensteinian. And of course, Turing and Wittgenstein knew each other. Turing was going to Wittgenstein's classes, and
oh wow!
I've always thought that there was a Wittgensteinian influence on Turing when he wrote that paper.
I see. So yeah. Many people interpret Turing, I did certainly before this conversation, as a behavioralist. But that might not be true, right? He might be this Wittgensteinian...
because his move right at the beginning of computing machinery and intelligence, the paper in question, his move is to say, does a machine think? Well, that's a really difficult question to answer for this, that, and the other reason, blah, blah, blah. Let's replace it by the following question. So he doesn't... He replaces the question, can a machine think, with a different one.
He doesn't reduce it to the other one.
He doesn't reduce it to the other one.
That would be the behavioralist position.
That would be a behavioral. Absolutely, exactly so.
Let me quote to you another piece from your writing. If suitably embodied as a humanoid robot, say, there's no reason to suppose that such a system could not interact with us in our environment in such a way that our attitudes towards it would be the attitude we take towards our peers and equals. We should like to situate consciousness as we know it within the larger picture of consciousness as it could be, and the possibility of artificial consciousness, of man-made artifacts with an inner life, is implicit here. The intuition behind the quote I just read, as well as the Garland test and the Turing test, is that in some sense the true test for consciousness is communal consensus in some, or like conventional reactions. But that's a bit different from what you suggested prior, which is an empirical investigation into, let's say, the neuronal structures. Those are two different ways, right?
Oh, but you can do both of those things. So who knows how, our use of the word consciousness and all the very many words associated with it is going to change and evolve over time. In our using the word, we may bring in all kinds of things, right? So in deciding whether we think octopuses are sentient and can suffer and deserve our moral concern, right? Then we look at their behavior. We also look at the scientific evidence for how they're constructed neuronally and so on. So all of that is grist to the mill of changing our consensual, conventional way of talking about them, and all of it, right? But all of it, note, is public. It's not. There's nothing metaphysically hidden about what's inside the octopus's brain. It might be practically hidden for temporarily, but it's not metaphysically hidden.
So what I'm hearing from you is there are two independent criterion, right? One is the convention of the community, and the other is the empirical foundations. But they're not conflicting in the sense that the conventions might change. And so the empirical criterion is simply to answer, are these things conscious in the way that we are conscious right now?
Yes.
But we very well might decide that we want to expand the definition of consciousness to include other types.
Yes. So I broadly agree with everything you just said. But I should point out that I think what you're calling the empirical criteria are part of they contribute to the convention, as far as I see it.
Right.
Our consensus for how we use the language of consciousness. So that can be shaped by many things, including what the scientists say who are studying this kind of stuff. So if scientists say, oh, well, we've been looking at octopuses and we see that they've got these things that are like nociceptors in mammals, and their brains are organized in this and that and the other kind of way, and so that all contributes to the consensus, to the convention. So I don't see these things as separate things.
Right.
So
But even when what can be investigated about the machine does not perfectly match our consciousness, I think the second point is to say we might want to expand the very definition of consciousness. Right?
Yes,
it goes kind of both ways in the empirical, right?
Well, we might want to absolutely, yeah. So the consensus of how we use the language of consciousness can change. That certainly can change.
Right. So as a summary for our audience, what this whole discussion around Wittgenstein has set us up for is to give us license to proceed with an empirical examination of our current consciousness, the current substrate, the current material substrates, if you will, of our current consciousness. And the theory you propose to explain it is called global workspace theory. So tell us about that.
Yes. So the idea is to think of a cognitive architecture in which there is a whole collection of parallel processes that are working at the same time. So intuitively, these may be processes that are to do with memory. So first I walk through the lobby and I see certain cues and chairs laid out and the reception and so on. And that triggers all kinds of memories. And so inside my brain, there's all sorts of little processes that are running, that are triggering associations with being in a hotel, with seeing these kinds of chairs and the reception and all kinds of things. And then I might pass a person and that might remind me of somebody. So all those kinds of processes are going on at the same time. You have all of these processes that are going on unconsciously in parallel, but some of them become really, really important to the current situation. And those ones that are sort of command attention, as it were, they take over the attention mechanism. So what they have to say, the information that they're dealing with, then gets broadcast throughout the brain. And so that's the global workspace. So they're contributing to the global workspace, and the essential metaphor there is broadcast. So there's a distinction there between the processing that's going on locally within these little processes versus the processing that's going on more globally, that's broadcast through the medium of broadcast.
To make it very simple, let's say I have memory, I have emotion, I have appetite. Let's say that there's a three parallel processes. In every moment, these three processes are competing for which one has the most important thing. And then that becomes broadcasted to the other parts. And that is what conscious experience is about.
Yes.
That's the rough claim, right?
Roughly, but I think I'd want to kind of break down the processes to be smaller ones.
Please.
So the memory side of it. So say I walk through the hotel lobby, and over on my left is a reception, and over to my right is the bar, and ahead of me is the lift. Well, you can imagine that in my memory, there's a whole lot of little processes that are being active that deal with bars, and they might be saying, "Hey, let's go and have a drink." There's a whole load of processes that are active that deal with hotel receptions, and they're thinking, "Oh, we need to check in. Let's take our luggage over there." And then there's a whole load of processes that deal with, getting in the lift and going to the third floor. But also, getting late. I need to meet Jonathan, right? So the need to meet Jonathan process, if you like to think of it that way, is going to cooperate with the go to the lift process, and together that's what they're going to broadcast to the whole brain,
right.
and they're going to shut out the kind of like, let's go to the bar and have a drink urge, and the let's think about bars and receptions perceptual bits.
Right.
So some things are going to be shut out, some things are going to kind of come together into an active coalition whose influence is going to permeate the whole brain.
So the explanation of consciousness by this theory is the coalition of processes that win the competition and that is broadcasted out into its entire system.
Right.
You wrote a paper titled A Cognitive Architecture That Combines Internal Simulation with a Global Workspace, where you presented a computer architecture, a robotics architecture specifically, that is built to imitate a global workspace, that there's these different competing processes, and the most important one gets broadcasted. Drawing from our Wittgenstein conversation, or do you also want to say that this kind of thing is conscious in some sense? Like if we imitate the conscious structure, the cognitive architecture of human consciousness in a machine, that will also become conscious.
No, because even if we accept global workspace theory for biological consciousness, but the idea there is that it would be a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition. Just having something that conforms to that description is not enough to sustain the level of complex behavior and or internal activity even that is going to lead us to treat something as a fellow conscious creature, right?
Right.
Fellow conscious being. Building something in that way may enable you to build something that does exhibit very sophisticated behavior. Maybe that's the key to doing that. Maybe.
I see. So let me try to tie this with our Wittgensteinian conversation, where Wittgenstein helped us clear the ground. Consciousness, investigating whether LLMs are conscious, can proceed empirically.
Yeah.
You looked at how current consciousness is sustained. That's the global workspace theory. And then you're saying this might be a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. But that's how you hope this research, right?
Yeah, that's how that will be the kind of trajectory. Yeah, this is all about the easy problem. So this is trying to explain the psychological and behavioral and cognitive aspects of consciousness.
So given the perhaps increased urgency of answering the AI consciousness question, what do you think are the other empirical methods we should explore alongside global workspace theory?
I think behavior is really, really important. So very often when people discuss consciousness, and I do suspect that this is another aspect of dualistic thinking, they tend to think of it as some disembodied, kind of thing. In the case of global workspace theory, what kinds of sophisticated behavior does having this cognitive architecture underpin, right? That's what's the point of it? Why is this cognitive architecture of interest? Well, it's of interest because it's a way of marshalling the resources of massively parallel computation, particularly in the case of biological wetware, because it's kind of anatomically distributed and there's all kinds of challenges with the wiring and things like that. So it may not actually be relevant in the computers in the case of AI.
And so embodiment, obviously, is one of the key terms in the title of your book. And the claim is that embodiment and behavior it seems to be another necessary condition in addition to the global workspace architecture.
Yes. So for our employing, so all of this is about, when would we want to employ the language of consciousness, right? So let's think about, just in the biological case, it may be that we employ the language of consciousness in the context of things that exhibit this kind of really sophisticated and rich behavior, And when we look into it, we discover that them instantiating this global workspace architecture is a really important part of that. So another really important word here is integration. So what the global workspace architecture facilitates is integration. So it means that the full resources of our brain can be brought to bear on the current situation.
How do you think about the precondition of embodiment given LLMs? Because LLMs sure seem to be unembodied. They've simply ingested a lot of text and sometimes other kinds of bits of information, and yet they seem to exhibit a great deal of intelligence.
Yes, indeed. So do you want to talk about intelligence or consciousness?
Maybe let's that's a great distinction, right? Because what do you think embodiment is the precondition for? Intelligence or consciousness? But maybe we can tackle them separately.
Yeah. So does it make sense to apply the word intelligence to contemporary large language model? I have to say, I think it does. I mean, how can you not? I mean, so it's just natural to say, I think, in the case of large.
It's the point of the Turing test, right? Yeah.
Well, yes, indeed, It is the point of the Turing test, and they do kind of pass the Turing test.
Yeah.
So I think it's natural to say they do have some kind of intelligence. Let's take another word, understanding. So that's a controversial one. So people have written and said they don't have real understanding and so on. But again, I think that there are many circumstances in which we cannot help applying the word understanding to them. So for example, I want to convert all my LaTeX entries to this format. So then I give it the thing I want to convert, and it does it, and it's kind of about right. But then I notice that it's sort of inserting more commas than or more spaces, say more white space than I like in my. So I say to it, but I only want to indent with two spaces, and it says, oh sure, here's the thing indented with two spaces, right? Now, you would have to say, well, it understood my instruction. It understood the original instruction, didn't completely understand it, but maybe it was a bit ambiguous. Then I corrected it, and it understood my correction, and it made it right. Now, why on earth would we not use the word understanding in those circumstances to characterize what's gone on there?
Maybe I can give another kind of pushback against the Wittgensteinian position as you presented it by just pushing the strategy a bit further, this idea of observing and understanding the cognitive architecture. So let's imagine I have a robot twin here. Looks exactly like me, purely silicon, okay? And he has a global workspace setup and of cognitive architecture. His behavior is one-to-one my behavior in the exact same scenario. And let's say we figure out even more biological preconditions of consciousness. All of it is imitated in his silicon architecture. And then the question is he conscious? Is it reasonable to think that he's conscious when you poke him? The exact same reaction that I have. I scream, I shout like a little girl. What's the answer there? This is where I think the empirical.
Well, sure, you can guess where I'm going to go with this kind of.
You're going to say yes, right?
No. I'm going to say. Well, it just how will we come to treat that thing? How will we come to speak of it as a society, as a community? So I'd want to replace your question with that question.
Right, but recall there were two standards. There was the consensus criterion, and then there was the empirical criterion. And I know that these are interrelated.
Okay. Well, I kind of corrected that as well. So the consensus draws on behavior, and it draws on ways it works inside. So so the way we come to treat it, that may be we may be very influenced by the fact that scientists say, oh, this is how it works inside. Look, it's only doing this, that, and the other. It's just a lookup table. So, oh, yeah, okay, well, we're not going to treat it. That may be the consensus, right? Or it may not. I don't know. We'd have to wait and see how things unfold. It's very hard to imagine.
And so in ordinary language, in the same way that you're comfortable in ordinary language with me saying, this is consciousness, this is not conscious, I'm conscious, he is either conscious or right, like he is conscious or there is a fact of the matter in ordinary language.
Well, as for this particular example, of course, I'm not going to answer the question. Is there a fact of the matter? When this thing has been among us for these things for 30 years, and we've all settled on the way we talk about these things and treat them and behave with them and interact with them, then you might ask somebody like me in that community, is there a fact of the matter about whether twin
and then in
Jonathan,
ordinary language,
and
you
then
would say
they would
yes
say
or no,
they would say, well, why you're adding that weird phrase, the fact of the matter, but of course it's conscious, or of course it's not.
Right.
I don't know.
I see. So let me put it this way. Let's say a society was determining who to harm, me or my twin, and let's say we all need to eat food. There's only one food enough for both of us.
Yeah.
Presumably, if this was a garbage can with no consciousness, you'd say giving it to the garbage can would be a morally wrong thing to do than giving it to Jonathan who's alive. Is there a right or wrong moral decision there? Presumably there is, given whether my digital twin or my robot twin can suffer or not. So the moral right or wrongness seems to be dependent on the consciousness question. So there is also a right or wrong there, right?
Yeah. Well,
societies can get it wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, societies can 100% get it wrong. So, but that in itself is taking us into difficult territory. Here is the way that I like to wriggle out of these situations, because I think there is an inherent tension here that we are always led to a point of tension, and then it's how we break out of that tension. So there's a sentence in my book where I say it's inherent in the language game of truth to say that truth is more than just a language game. And there we have to let the matter rest.
Right. So when the Europeans first discovered America, there was a big debate about whether the Native Americans were real humans or not. The answer is yes. They are real humans. They can suffer.
I don't think I can escape from my the society I live in and conceive of thinking of them as not conscious beings who suffer.
So let's say, and this is very plausible, in one society or one political party, one community, they treat my digital twin as the same as me, as moral standing.
Yeah.
One, they treat him as completely like the garbage can. Is there nothing more the philosopher can say about is someone wrong or someone right? Or
I don't know. I mean, we have to try and reconcile these communities, because or maybe we can't. I don't know.
Right.
Which community am I in this situation?
Right.
Are you in this hypothetical situation? Where are you putting me?
I don't know. I don't know.
My answer to this question depends upon where you put me, of course.
Okay, so let's say you were in the camp that thought that we had equal moral standing, and there's another community of people.
Well, if I'm in that camp, then I'm going to think we're having. Even if I'm in that camp, I'm going to think we're not.
Right. So back in the European debate, the Native Americans.
Well, I'm in this camp of me today, and I cannot stand outside of that, and I find it utterly morally repugnant.
Right, to think that Native Americans aren't people.
Yes.
Right, because it's wrong. Yeah, because they are. Because.
So this is getting well. Okay, let me ask you. You're very much drawn to Buddhism as well, and So do you think that this is the moral question there, a question of compassion there? Is that are you asking a question that is a matter of conventional truth or absolute truth?
I think
ultimate truth.
What might be different between that question and the thought experiment I set up is, in the case of the Native American example, the reason it's based on what I conceive to be a factual error, thinking them not to be humans.
Yes.
But
is a factual error, is that a matter of convention or is it a matter of ultimate reality?
Between the Native Americans.
Yeah.
So my Buddhist training, you're pushing me to say convention, of course,
Okay. So fair enough, right? You're kind of stuck there. Well, so am I. Hey, it's very difficult for us to step outside of things that we find utterly morally repellent. And of course, you can conjure up moral dilemmas that I don't know the answer to.
Let me ask a final set of questions on the hardware or wetware that the brain and the computer is based on. So this is another quote from your Embodiment book. Mathematical considerations separate brains from conventional computers. A complete description of the instantaneous state of a computer is possible using a finite set of binary or natural numbers. The membrane potential of a neuron, to pick just one physical property, is a continuous quantity, and its exact value is pertinent to predicting the neuron's behavior. A related point is that the entire state of a computer advances to its successor when and only when the computer's centralized clock ticks, so that all its internal events line up in time like a row of soldiers. But events in the brain, such as neuron firings, do not keep time in this orderly way. An electrical spike can be emitted by a neuron at any time, where time, of course, is another continuous variable. From a mathematical point of view, this property alone could be enough to push the dynamics of the brain beyond the class of Turing computable functions. The brain operates on a continuum, both in the firings of the neurons themselves, as well as on the time, or asynchronous versus synchronous. Does this mean, theoretically, the human brain might have intellectual capacities that are just beyond any type of Turing machines?
Well, okay, so it certainly means mathematically and theoretically that it could fall into a class of computations which is outside of the Turing class of computations. So that is a mathematical fact. But on the other hand, we also know that Turing computations can simulate a continuous system to any arbitrary degree of fidelity, to any degree of fidelity that you like. You just make your numbers, give them more decimal places, right? Now, you're never going to give them an infinite number of decimal places, but you can always add more decimal places, basically, to numbers. So you can simulate any physical process to any arbitrary degree of fidelity. Now, mathematically, they're different. They remain different. But does that matter functionally? That's really what you're asking. I have no idea. I suspect not. I suspect that
because you can imitate it to any arbitrary degree, right?
Yeah, I mean, so that would be my inclination would be to think that there's no barrier to what you can do with a computer because of this mathematical fact.
Right. In your embodiment book, you described all the different types of the brain's architecture that we have not simulated, right? Basically what we've done with current LLMs, transformer architecture, generative large language models, is just taking the neuron, the neural net kind of architecture, and then just scaling up into a tremendous degree. Why has just imitating that part of the brain, and not all this other functionality, been able to replicate so much of human behavior that needed the whole brain?
Well, so first of all, what we have in neural networks today, in artificial neural networks, is very, very different to what we have in the brain.
In real,
So artificial artificial neurons are not really much like real neurons at all. So that's one very, very important caveat. And the kind of learning that goes on is very, very different to the kind of learning that goes on in real brains.
So the question is even more interesting in some sense.
It is actually even more interesting in a way. Yeah. So how is it that using this very different substrate, we've managed to kind of create these this extraordinary sort of simulacrum of intelligence? The interesting thing is that we don't really know.
Yeah,
we don't really. That's the bizarre position that we've ended up in, which I would not have anticipated if you'd asked me when I wrote that book, 15 years ago. Where we're building things, and because we're training them on very large amounts of training data, and they're very, very large collections of neurons, very, very big networks, and then all the weights, these networks change as a result of training, and then as if by magic, they end up with this extraordinary functionality, but we don't really understand how they work at a level that would enable us to explain the intelligence there.
Yeah,
as far as there is intelligence there.
Maybe I can ask this question in a slightly different way, like we asked the Satori before singularity question, which is, what does it tell us about human intelligence? Because for the longest time, the dominant paradigm of AI is symbolic AI. And for our listeners back home, this is giving declarative, logical propositions that chain together in various ways to solve problems.
Yeah.
What has worked instead is these black boxes of rough simulations of, not even to your point, of neural nets that is able to produce behavior that symbolic AI is just so far away from. So is this something that we can learn about human consciousness?
Absolutely.
Which is this. The Stoics take an extremely intellectualist view of human nature. behind human nature are these series of propositional statements that we're assenting to. That is what they think is driving the human machine.
Yes.
But maybe that's not it, right? Maybe for us, what is at basis is a much more complicated biological architecture, which the logical statements are only surface manifestations of. Is that something you'd be
I think that's absolutely right.
Right.
I think, if to put it crudely, I think we've probably arrived at the conclusion that, human level cognition is implemented on a spaghetti-like mess. It doesn't have the kind of structure. Right. It doesn't have the kind of structure that we intuitively think should be there. It's a mess. And I think that in my own intellectual trajectory as an AI researcher, it's been a kind of a gradual retreat from wanting to build things in a way that is intelligible, where the architecture is fundamentally intelligible.
You were on the symbolic side for a long time.
For quite a few years. Yeah, I mean, I also abandoned it a very long time ago. But then the interesting thing is that then, even when I was working in machine learning and in neural networks, and what I spent a long time on was trying to learn representations, neural representations that nevertheless had a sort of symbolic-like structure.
Right. You're kind of clinging on to the philosophy.
Yeah, I was clinging on to that kind of vision of things, that things had to have a compositional structure like language, they would be learned and they would be realized on the neural kind of substrate, but nevertheless, at some important level, they had to have this language-like compositional structure of like objects, predicates, and propositions and things, and
a topography, essentially, right?
Yeah, and then I gradually had to retreat more and more and more from that position, and even so I think then you retreat a bit more, and then you think, okay, let's stop trying to force the architecture to have that structure. So the neural architecture, right? So we're way out of GoFine,
right?
Good old-fashioned AI, symbolic AI, but I'm still trying to kind of force the representations that are learned within the neural substrate to sort of have a kind of symbolic-like structure. Then, okay, that doesn't work either. So then maybe you're thinking, well, okay, let's let it all emerge, right? So we'll have this kind of
complete black box. Yeah, right.
But then surely we'll find that there are these structures there when we look.
But even that is not.
But even that doesn't seem to be the case, right? You find that you train these things, then there's a whole field of mechanistic interpretability that's trying to understand what goes on inside. Well, that's a mess as well. It still looks like a mess. You just keep looking inside, and of course they've made a lot of progress. There are things that you can extract, but they don't look like the intuitive categories we had for how we would understand cognition in the past in terms of language-like propositional representations and so on.
In some sense, your entire life has been a series of retreats.
It has.
But not just on the computer science side, but it sounds like also on the philosophical side.
Oh, I don't know about that.
Did you not retreat to the Wittgensteinian position from a dualist? Oh, you started.
Well. I mean, I still haven't escaped the dualist position, right? But I know where I need to go.
Right.
I think.
But you see what I'm trying to say on the metaphysical side, where I imagine as any kid growing up interested in this, you think, well, there must be an essence. Well, is it atoms?
Of course.
And then you until you see the mirror, like it's a both turning to Wittgenstein as well as turning away from symbolic AI is a kind of relinquishing control in a mature way, right?
If you like, yeah. Although I think it's a bit different with the philosophy, because with the philosophy, I don't think I've got where I want to go, but I knew where I needed to go from a very long time ago.
I see.
Which is what Buddhism and Wittgenstein, because you've obviously thought deeply about these issues as well, right? And so, of course, you can easily kind of conjure up these dualistic thoughts with these kinds of going down the sort of line of thinking that you're. So it's sort of a bit different, right?
Yeah.
So I've long known what the destination should be, but not quite got there with the philosophy. With how you build AI and how you understand cognition, and it really has been a series of retreats.
Yeah.
But that's progress. I mean, if you change your mind, that's learning. Rich Sutton, of course, famously described this, very similar thing as the bitter lesson. I don't know if you've come.
Yes.
So he has this paper called The Bitter Lesson, where he says that, what we've learned is over the years we started, thinking that we want to build things that we can understand, and we're going to reveal, and that's what makes it exciting. We'll understand these things that we're building, and it's by understanding that we can be able to build them. But in fact, we've had to relinquish all of that and realize that what you do is you use learning, you use scaling, and you use search, and you use a lot of computation. So you scale the training data, you scale the computation, you scale search, and those are the things. Mindless stuff at scale is what works.
Where do you think
it's a bitter lesson because intellectually there's something frustrating about that.
Yeah, we want it to be this beautiful topography, this Platonic form, right? But so your work, your intellectual work as a AI researcher, as a philosopher, do you think AI is going to replace a great deal of this? Certainly, it's already augmented. I mean, even in my own work. But do you think? Yeah, do you think AI is going to replace
the intellectual?
Yeah, it replace a lot of intellectual work that you do now.
Well, so when it comes to the philosophy, I mean, there's no point in it replacing it
because you need to be the one doing it.
Yes, of course. I mean, that's like getting a robot to run around a running track for you. I mean, that is literally pointless, right? And by the way, I think you can make similar answers to using AI in creative contexts as well.
The point is not the production. The point is the cultivation.
Right. Of course, for some people, the point is the production is part of the point because they make their living out of it. So this is like really important issue for
philosophy professors. Yeah.
Well, for philosophy professors and people working in the creative industries as well. And these are important issues. But if I'm doing my art project, at home for my own satisfaction, I'm not going to just prompt an AI to do it. I'm just, because I want to make the thing. That's the point. The same as I don't want to make a robot run around the track for me. Because similarly, you can't do, I can't make an AI do philosophy for me because that's not going to give me insight. But you can, in all of these cases,
accelerate.
Use them as tools to help you.
What about the AI researcher point? Because that, I imagine, at least compared to philosophy, is a lot more about the production.
Well,
right?
That's true. Yes. So I think AI research, as with many things, is going to be augmented and enhanced by AI. Of course,
but not just that, but the potential of perhaps replacing. The word.
Yeah, well, maybe, indeed. Yeah, sure.
I see.
And who knows where we go from there.
What do you think, if you have kids, how do you think about educating them right now? Like what kind of skills?
Well, great question. I think we need to educate people in how to live well.
Philosophy.
Maybe not the kind of philosophy we've been talking about here, but what is a good life? It's a different philosophical question. I remember reading a few years back, which is Keynes. John Maynard Keynes has this paper called The Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, which he wrote in 1930. And there he's imagining a future where a sort of utopian, potentially future of abundance, where economic challenges have been overcome and people just can lead lives of leisure. But then he poses the question, well, what do we do then, really? What would it mean to lead a good life under those circumstances when certain aspects of meaning are taken away from us? I think these are extremely good questions. I don't personally have answers to those ones.
I see. Well, thank you for a fascinating interview, Professor. This has been amazing.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I enjoyed it very much.
Thanks for watching my interview. If you like these kinds of discussions, I think you fit in great with the ecosystem we're building at Cosmos. We fund research, incubate, and invest in AI startups, and believe that philosophy is critical to building technology. If you want to join our ecosystem of philosopher builders, you can find roles we're hiring for, events we're hosting, and other ways to get involved on jonathanb.com/cosmos. Thank you.